Major Tadashi Kobayashi pressed his hand against the cold, reinforced concrete wall of Bunker Complex 7 and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The fortification had taken 18 months to complete, with walls 4 feet thick and a ceiling reinforced with steel rails salvaged from the island's abandoned railway. Standing inside this masterpiece of defensive engineering on the morning of February 16, 1945, he felt an unshakable confidence that no amount of American firepower could penetrate these defenses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Outside, through the narrow observation slit, he could see the gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond that horizon, he knew, the American fleet was approaching. Let them come, he thought. Let them waste their ammunition against walls that would stand for 1,000 years. What Major Kobayashi could not have imagined, what none of the Japanese commanders on the island could have conceived, was that within 72 hours, these supposedly impregnable fortifications would be reduced to shattered fragments of concrete and twisted metal, victims of a naval bombardment doctrine that defied everything the Imperial Japanese Army believed about defensive warfare. The story of the concrete bunkers begins not on the volcanic island where they would meet their fate, but in the minds of Japanese military engineers who had spent years perfecting what they believed was an unbreakable defensive system. Following devastating losses in the Marshall and Mariana Islands throughout 1944, Imperial General Headquarters had issued new directives emphasizing fortified positions over mobile defense. The doctrine was simple and seemingly logical. If American industrial might could produce unlimited ships, aircraft, and ammunition, then Japanese forces would create defensive positions so strong that even unlimited firepower would prove insufficient. Colonel Hideaki Matsumoto, chief engineer for the island's defensive works, had arrived in August 1944 with blueprints that represented the culmination of Japanese defensive thinking. He gathered his subordinate officers in a sweltering underground command post and spread the plans across a makeshift table constructed from ammunition crates. His finger traced the network of interconnected bunkers, artillery positions, and underground tunnels that would transform the island into what he called an unsinkable fortress. The Americans have shown they can land anywhere and bring overwhelming force, Matsumoto explained to his assembled officers. But they cannot land if we make it impossible to establish a beachhead. Every meter of beach will be covered by interlocking fields of fire from positions they cannot destroy. Their naval guns fire in a flat trajectory and cannot penetrate properly designed overhead cover. Their aircraft drop bombs that detonate on impact, useless against deeply buried positions. We will bleed them white on the beaches, and when their attack falters, we will have achieved our strategic objective. The logic seemed impeccable to the officers listening in that humid underground chamber. Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved significantly since the early war years, when island garrisons had often met American invasions with suicidal banzai charges that accomplished nothing but their own annihilation. Now, sophisticated defensive positions would force the Americans to pay an impossible price for every island, potentially breaking their will to continue the advance toward the Japanese home islands. Major Kobayashi, assigned as Matsumoto's deputy, threw himself into the construction effort with almost religious dedication. A civil engineer in peacetime who had helped construct several major bridges in Manchuria, he brought technical expertise that complemented Matsumoto's military experience. Together, they supervised the construction of more than 300 reinforced concrete positions across the island's 11 square miles. The bunkers followed a standardized design that Kobayashi had refined through careful study of American bombardment patterns at previous battles. Each position featured walls between 3 and 5 feet thick, constructed from concrete mixed with volcanic sand and reinforced with whatever steel could be obtained. The roofs incorporated multiple layers, including steel rails or ship plates when available, concrete, more steel, and finally coral and volcanic rock for additional mass and to help dissipate the impact of bombs or shells. Firing apertures were kept deliberately small, just large enough for a machine gun barrel or rifle to protrude, minimizing vulnerability to direct fire while maintaining fields of fire that covered every approach. Entrances faced away from expected bombardment directions and were protected by sharp angles and access tunnels, preventing blast effects from propagating into the main chambers. Interior spaces were compartmented with thick walls, ensuring that even one section was compromised, defenders could fall back to adjacent positions. Lieutenant Kenji Yamada, a young officer fresh from engineering school in Tokyo, kept detailed construction logs that revealed the meticulous attention devoted to these positions. His entries from October 1944 noted that each cubic meter of concrete required precise ratios of cement brought from the Philippines, volcanic aggregate from island quarries, and water from carefully managed sources. Steel reinforcement came from dismantled buildings, ships, and even the island's pre-war infrastructure. "We are literally transforming the entire island into a weapon," Yamada wrote in his journal. "Every building has been stripped, every piece of metal repurposed, every natural feature incorporated into our defensive system. When the Americans arrive, they will find not an island garrison, but a fortress that will consume their strength and resolve." The confidence pervading the garrison stemmed from more than just the physical strength of their fortifications. It reflected a broader assessment by Imperial General Headquarters that American forces, despite their material advantages, lacked the stomach for sustained high casualties. Japanese intelligence analysts had carefully studied American newspapers and radio broadcasts, noting what they interpreted as declining morale on the home front as casualty lists from Pacific battles mounted. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, the garrison's intelligence officer, prepared regular assessments for Colonel Matsumoto based on these intercepts. His reports from late 1944 painted a picture of an American public growing weary of the Pacific War's grinding brutality. Opinion polls showed declining support for unconditional surrender demands, one report noted. Political opposition to continued offensive operations is growing. "If we can inflict sufficient casualties in the next major battle, we may force negotiated peace terms that preserve the empire's core territories." This strategic assessment reinforced the tactical confidence placed in the concrete bunkers. The defensive positions were not merely military installations, but instruments of strategic policy designed to break American will through attrition. Every American casualty inflicted from these positions brought Japan closer to a negotiated peace that might salvage something from the war. The construction effort required enormous labor. The garrison included approximately 11,000 combat troops, but an additional 5,000 Korean and Japanese laborers had been brought to the island specifically for construction work. These workers toiled in brutal conditions, mixing concrete by hand, hauling materials across volcanic terrain, and excavating underground positions in volcanic rock so hard that progress was measured in feet per day rather than yards. Conditions grew increasingly difficult as American submarines tightened their blockade around Japan's remaining island possessions. Cement shipments became irregular, forcing engineers to experiment with different concrete mixtures that used less cement and more volcanic aggregate. Food supplies dwindled, and workers subsisted on reduced rations that barely provided sufficient calories for the backbreaking labor demanded of them. Despite these hardships, construction continued through the fall and winter of 1945. By January 1945, the defensive system was substantially complete. More than 300 major fortified positions dotted the island, connected by 11 miles of tunnels that allowed defenders to move between positions while protected from bombardment. Artillery pieces, ranging from small anti-tank guns to massive coastal defense weapons, were emplaced in concrete casemates with interlocking fields of fire covering every potential landing beach. Major Kobayashi conducted regular inspections of completed positions, checking concrete thickness with measurements and personally testing firing angles from each bunker. His inspection reports, preserved in captured Japanese documents, reveal an engineer's pride in work done to exacting standards. Bunker Complex 7, inspected January 12, 1945, he wrote, "Wall thickness verified at 4 feet 2 inches exceeds specification. Overhead cover includes 6 inches of steel plate, 14 inches of concrete, and 4 feet of coral rock, estimated to withstand direct hits from 16-inch naval guns. Position is ready for combat operations. This assessment that the bunkers could withstand even the heaviest American naval gunfire was widely shared throughout the garrison. Japanese defensive doctrine, based on experiences at previous battles, held that naval gunfire was impressive in volume but relatively ineffective against properly constructed fortifications. Ships fired from moving platforms at long range, making precision difficult. Naval shells, designed primarily for use against other ships, detonated on impact rather than penetrating deeply before exploding. Most critically, naval guns fire on relatively flat trajectory that made hitting reverse slope positions or targets with substantial overhead cover extremely difficult. Colonel Matsumoto, briefing his officers in late January, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. At the sound of alarm bells, troops would rush into the fortified positions and seal themselves inside, remaining there while simulated bombardment continued overhead. These exercises reinforced the message that safety lay in the concrete bunkers, that the massive fortifications provided absolute protection against anything the Americans could deliver. What neither Matsumoto nor any other Japanese officer on the island understood was that American naval doctrine had evolved dramatically in response to the challenges of island warfare. The flat trajectory, on-impact detonation shells that had characterized earlier bombardments were being supplemented and replaced by new ammunition types specifically designed to destroy fortified positions. American ordnance engineers, analyzing the difficulties encountered in earlier island assaults, had developed armor-piercing shells with delayed fuses designed to penetrate concrete before detonating. These shells, originally developed for use against heavily armored battleships, proved devastatingly effective against reinforced concrete fortifications. Rather than exploding on impact and cratering the surface, they would punch through several feet of concrete before their delayed fuse triggered the main explosive charge, destroying the fortification from within. Even more significant was the development of new fire control systems and bombardment techniques. American battleships and cruisers now employed sophisticated radar-directed fire control that allowed them to engage targets with unprecedented accuracy even in poor visibility or at extreme range. Forward observers, either aboard aircraft or infiltrated onto islands before the main assault, could direct naval gunfire onto specific targets with corrections radioed directly to the firing ships. Perhaps most importantly, American naval commanders had learned to allocate time for methodical destruction of fortifications rather than brief, intense bombardments. Earlier island assaults had featured relatively short preparatory bombardments lasting hours or at most a day or two. By early 1945, American doctrine called for sustained bombardments lasting days or even weeks, with specific fortifications targeted for systematic destruction. None of these developments were known to the Japanese defenders preparing their concrete fortresses. Japanese intelligence, increasingly isolated by American submarine warfare and air superiority, had limited ability to gather information about American tactical and technical developments. The defenders on the island based their confidence on experiences and information that were increasingly outdated. In mid-February 1945, as American reconnaissance aircraft began appearing over the island with increasing frequency, the garrison went to full alert. Colonel Matsumoto issued final instructions to his subordinates. "The Americans are coming," he announced at a command meeting on February 15th. "They will find us ready. Every position is prepared. Every field of fire is clear. Every man knows his duty. Let them come with their ships and their aircraft. Let them expend their ammunition against walls that will not fall. When they attempt to land, we will destroy them. This island will be their grave, not ours." Major Kobayashi returned to Bunker Complex 7 after that meeting and conducted one final inspection. Everything was ready. Ammunition was stacked neatly in the concrete chambers. Water and rations sufficient for 2 weeks were stored in the underground spaces. Medical supplies were positioned throughout the tunnel system. The massive steel door that sealed the bunker's entrance was tested and found to operate smoothly despite its weight. Standing in the central chamber of the bunker complex, surrounded by concrete walls whose thickness he had personally verified, Kobayashi felt that same sense of satisfaction he had experienced 18 months earlier when construction began. This fortress would protect his men. This fortress would break the American attack. This fortress was impregnable. In less than 72 hours, he would discover just how catastrophically wrong that assessment had been. The evening of February 15th found the garrison settling into what they expected would be their final night before the American assault began. In bunkers across the island, soldiers prepared their weapons, wrote final letters to families they would never see again, and tried to rest despite the tension of impending combat. Officers made final inspections, checking that every position was fully manned and supplied, that communications lines were functioning, that observation posts were alert for the first signs of the approaching American fleet. Lieutenant Yamada, the young engineering officer who had documented the construction process so meticulously, wrote what would prove to be his final journal entry that evening. "Tomorrow the Americans will come, and we will show them the futility of their material strength against properly prepared defenses. I have absolute confidence in the positions we have built. The concrete is strong, the steel is thick, the design is sound. Let them bring their battleships, let them fire until their guns are worn out. These walls will stand, and Japan will be proud of what we accomplish here." In the pre-dawn darkness of February 16th, lookouts in coastal observation posts reported the first sighting of the American fleet. Even experienced observers who had seen American task forces before were stunned by the scale of the approaching armada. Hundreds of ships stretched across the horizon, from battleships and cruisers to transports and support vessels. This was not a raid or a diversionary operation. This was an invasion fleet of unprecedented scale, bringing overwhelming force against an island fortress that its defenders believed to be impregnable. As the gray light of dawn spread across the Pacific, Major Kobayashi stood at the observation slit of Bunker Complex 7 and watched the American ships maneuvering into bombardment positions. The sight was impressive, even terrifying in its implications, but he felt no fear. Around him, concrete walls 4 feet thick provided security that no amount of enemy firepower could overcome. Or so he believed. The truth, which would become horrifyingly apparent within hours, was that everything the Japanese defenders believed about the strength of their fortifications was about to be violently disproven. The first salvos from the American fleet arrived at precisely 0630 hours, announced by a sound unlike anything the Japanese defenders had experienced before. It was not the whistle of falling bombs or the crack of small-caliber gunfire, but a deep bass rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the island. Major Kobayashi, still at his observation post in Bunker Complex 7, watched geysers of earth and rock erupt across the landscape as 16-inch shells from the battleships found their range. The bombardment began methodically, almost scientifically. Rather than the scattered, brief barrage the defenders had expected, the American ships settled into deliberate firing patterns that suggested careful planning and coordination. Individual fortifications were targeted in sequence, with multiple ships concentrating their fire on single positions until satisfied with the results before moving to the next target. This was not suppressive fire meant to keep defenders' heads down. This was systematic destruction. Captain Hiroshi Kanaka, the intelligence officer, had positioned himself in the underground command center with Colonel Matsumoto. As reports began flowing in from observation posts across the island, Tanaka felt his confidence begin to erode. The shelling was far heavier and more accurate than intelligence assessments had predicted. Even more disturbing were reports that some fortifications were being hit repeatedly by shells that seemed to be penetrating the concrete before exploding. Bunker Complex 12 reports severe damage, a radio operator called out, reading from incoming messages. Multiple penetrations of the overhead cover. Complex 18 has gone silent. Last transmission reported direct hit on the main chamber. Complex 23 requests permission to evacuate. Structure is collapsing. Colonel Matsumoto's face remained impassive, but his hands gripped the edge of the plotting table with increasing tension. These positions were designed to withstand this kind of bombardment, he insisted to his staff. The reports must be exaggerated. Men under fire always overestimate the damage. The positions will hold. But the positions were not holding. Across the island, the concrete fortifications that had taken 18 months to construct were being methodically destroyed in a matter of hours. The armor-piercing shells that American ordnance engineers had developed specifically for this purpose were performing exactly as designed. Rather than exploding harmlessly against the surface of the concrete, they punched through the reinforced walls and detonated inside the fortifications, transforming protective bunkers into death traps. In Bunker Complex 7, Major Kobayashi experienced the first penetration at 0715 hours. The observation slit he had been using suddenly filled with a blinding flash as a shell struck the bunker's roof. The entire structure shuddered, and a section of the reinforced ceiling collapsed, crushing 2 soldiers who had been manning a machine gun position. Dust filled the air, making breathing difficult, and somewhere in the darkness, men were screaming. Kobayashi staggered through the smoke and debris, trying to assess the damage. What he saw defied everything he understood about defensive engineering. A hole approximately 2 feet in diameter had been punched through 4 feet of reinforced concrete and multiple layers of steel reinforcement. The shell had penetrated the overhead cover before exploding, and the blast had devastated the interior of what had been designed as an impregnable position. "All positions report to command," he shouted into the field telephone, but the line was dead. The communications cables, buried in trenches that were supposed to protect them from bombardment, had been severed by the intensity of the shelling. Kobayashi was isolated in a bunker that was supposed to provide absolute protection, but was instead becoming a tomb. Lieutenant Kenji Yamada, the young engineering officer whose journals had documented the construction process with such pride, was in Bunker Complex 20 when American shells found it. His position, built into a hillside with what he had calculated was optimal overhead protection, took a direct hit from a battleship's main gun at 0742 hours. The armor-piercing shell penetrated 6 feet of earth, 3 feet of reinforced concrete, and 2 layers of steel plating before exploding in the bunker's ammunition storage area. The resulting secondary explosion killed everyone in the bunker instantly. Yamada's body, along with those of 37 other soldiers, would not be recovered until American forces occupied the position 3 days later. His journal, found in the ruins of the command post weeks after the battle, ended with that confident entry from the night before about walls that would stand and guns that could fire until worn out. By 900 hours, more than a third of the island's major fortifications had been destroyed or severely damaged. The systematic nature of the bombardment became increasingly apparent as the morning progressed. American forward observers, positioned on offshore islands and aboard aircraft circling above, were directing fire with devastating precision. Individual bunkers were being engaged by multiple ships simultaneously, with shells arriving in carefully timed sequences that gave defenders no respite. Colonel Matsumoto, receiving increasingly desperate reports in the command center, finally began to grasp the magnitude of the disaster unfolding above him. The Americans had developed capabilities that Japanese intelligence had failed to detect or anticipate. Their shells were penetrating fortifications designed to be impervious. Their fire control was accurate enough to target individual positions. Their ammunition supply appeared unlimited, with no slackening in the intensity of fire as hours passed. "We must order the men out of the fortifications," Captain Tanaka urged. "The bunkers are becoming death traps. We should disperse the troops into the tunnel systems and natural caves until the bombardment ends." Matsumoto hesitated. Everything in Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized holding fortified positions during bombardment. To abandon the bunkers was to abandon the entire defensive concept that had guided months of preparation. But the evidence was undeniable. The concrete fortresses were failing. Before Matsumoto could issue orders, the command center itself took a direct hit. A 16-inch shell from the battleship USS Nevada, guided by a forward observer who had identified the command post's location, penetrated 40 feet of volcanic rock and exploded directly above the underground facility. The blast collapsed the main chamber, killing Colonel Matsumoto and 14 staff officers instantly. Captain Tanaka, positioned in an adjacent room, survived but was trapped under debris with both legs crushed. The loss of the command center meant the loss of centralized control. Individual position commanders were now isolated, unable to communicate with higher headquarters or coordinate their actions. Some ordered their men out of the disintegrating bunkers, seeking shelter in caves and tunnel systems. Others, following their last orders, kept their troops in the fortifications even as the structures collapsed around them. Major Kobayashi in Bunker Complex 7 made the decision to evacuate after the third shell penetrated his position at 10:35 hours. This strike killed another 6 men and started fires in the ammunition storage areas that threatened to cook off stored explosives. Kobayashi led the survivors out through the access tunnel, emerging into a landscape transformed into something from a nightmare. The carefully prepared defensive positions had been reduced to rubble. Entire hillsides had been reshaped by the bombardment. Craters 30 feet deep and 50 feet across dotted the terrain. The smell of high explosives, burning vegetation, and death hung heavy in the air. Of the 42 men who had been in Bunker Complex 7 that morning, 19 staggered out of the ruins. The rest were dead or trapped under tons of collapsed concrete. The bombardment continued throughout the day and into the night. American ships rotated on and off the firing line, some withdrawing to replenish ammunition, while others took their place, maintaining continuous fire. The island, which had been transformed over 18 months into a fortress, was being systematically destroyed in less than 24 hours. As darkness fell on February 16th, survivors huddled in caves and undamaged sections of the tunnel system, listening to the shells continuing to fall. Men who had been supremely confident that morning were now traumatized and demoralized. The concrete fortifications that were supposed to provide absolute protection had proven to be traps. The carefully prepared defensive positions had been demolished before a single American soldier had set foot on the beaches. In one of the remaining intact tunnel sections, Major Kobayashi gathered a group of surviving officers to assess the situation. His uniform was torn and covered with concrete dust, his face bore cuts from flying debris, and his hands trembled slightly as he spread a tactical map across an ammunition crate. "The defensive system has been destroyed," he said quietly. "The fortifications we spent 18 months building have been reduced to rubble in one day. Everything we believed about the protective value of reinforced concrete has been proven wrong." A young lieutenant, barely 20 years old, spoke up. "What do we do now, sir? The Americans will land soon. Without the bunkers, how can we stop them?" Kobayashi had no answer. The entire defensive plan had been predicated on intact fortifications, providing protected firing positions from which to engage landing forces. With those positions destroyed, the garrison faced American assault with no coherent defensive structure. They were reduced to what Japanese doctrine had explicitly moved away from: isolated groups of soldiers without mutual support or protected positions. The bombardment continued into its second day with the same methodical intensity. American ships demonstrated no concern about ammunition expenditure, firing thousands of shells to ensure complete destruction of fortified positions. Spotting aircraft directed fire onto any structure that showed signs of continued occupation. Even positions that appeared completely destroyed received additional shells to ensure no defenders could utilize the ruins. By the afternoon of February 17th, aerial reconnaissance showed that more than 90% of the island's fortifications had been destroyed or rendered unusable. The concrete bunkers that were supposed to withstand anything the Americans could deliver had been systematically reduced to shattered fragments. As darkness fell on February 16th, survivors huddled in caves and undamaged sections of the tunnel system, listening to the shells continuing to fall. Men who had been supremely confident that morning were now traumatized and demoralized. The concrete fortifications that were supposed to provide absolute protection had proven to be traps. The carefully prepared defensive positions had been demolished before a single American soldier had set foot on the beaches. In one of the remaining intact tunnel sections, Major Kobayashi gathered a group of surviving officers to assess the situation. His uniform was torn and covered with concrete dust, his face bore cuts from flying debris, and his hands trembled slightly as he spread a tactical map across an ammunition crate. "The defensive system has been destroyed," he said quietly. "The fortifications we spent 18 months building have been reduced to rubble in one day. Everything we believed about the protective value of reinforced concrete has been proven wrong." A young lieutenant, barely 20 years old, spoke up. "What do we do now, sir? The Americans will land soon. Without the bunkers, how can we stop them?" Kobayashi had no answer. The entire defensive plan had been predicated on intact fortifications providing protected firing positions from which to engage landing forces. With those positions destroyed, the garrison faced American assault with no coherent defensive structure. They were reduced to what Japanese doctrine had explicitly moved away from: isolated groups of soldiers without mutual support or protected positions. The bombardment continued into its second day with the same methodical intensity. American ships demonstrated no concern about ammunition expenditure, firing thousands of shells to ensure complete destruction of fortified positions. Spotting aircraft direct. The defensive system that had consumed 18 months of brutal labor and represented the culmination of Japanese defensive engineering had been demolished in less than 48 hours. Major Kobayashi, moving through the ruins on the second day, encountered the shattered remains of Bunker Complex 12. This position, built to identical specifications as his own, had taken what appeared to be a direct hit from multiple armor-piercing shells. The 4-foot-thick walls had been penetrated in at least 6 places. The interior was completely destroyed, with massive chunks of concrete scattered across an area the size of a football field. Bodies of defenders, or pieces of bodies, lay among the rubble. He found Lieutenant Ishida, one of the engineers who had helped design the fortifications, sitting on a chunk of shattered concrete, staring at the destruction with hollow eyes. Ishida had been certain that the bunkers would hold. He had personally supervised the construction of this complex, had verified every measurement, had been absolutely confident in the design. "It should have held," Ishida said quietly as Kobayashi approached. "The calculations were correct. The concrete was properly mixed and cured. The steel reinforcement was positioned according to specifications. It should have held." Kobayashi sat down next to the lieutenant, too exhausted to remain standing. "Their shells are different from what we expected," he said. "They penetrate before exploding. Our entire design was predicated on shells detonating on impact. We were preparing for the wrong weapon." The two engineers sat in silence, contemplating the magnitude of their miscalculation. They had been so confident, so certain that their concrete fortresses would provide protection. They had believed that Japanese engineering and defensive doctrine were superior to American offensive capabilities. The ruins surrounding them told a different story. As the second day of bombardment drew to a close, the American fleet ceased fire for the first time since the operation began. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the bombardment had been. Survivors emerged cautiously from caves and tunnels, looking out at an island that had been transformed beyond recognition. Where carefully constructed defensive positions had stood, only craters and rubble remained. The fortress that was supposed to bleed the Americans white had been destroyed before the real battle even began. Major Kobayashi climbed to a ridge that had once hosted Bunker Complex 15, now nothing but scattered concrete fragments. From this vantage point, he could see the American fleet lying offshore, hundreds of ships preparing for the amphibious assault that would come with the next dawn. He could also see, spread across the devastated landscape below him, the ruins of 18 months of work, the shattered remnants of fortifications that were supposed to be impregnable. A young corporal climbed up to the ridge and stood beside him, looking out at the American fleet. "What do we do when they land, sir?" the soldier asked. "Without the bunkers, how can we fight?" Kobayashi had no comforting answer. The entire defensive plan was in ruins, as thoroughly destroyed as the concrete bunkers themselves. They would fight with whatever remains, from whatever positions they could improvise, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The fortress had failed. The concrete walls had crumbled. The supreme confidence of just 2 days ago had been replaced by the bitter knowledge that they had been catastrophically wrong about everything. In the remaining hours before the American landing, survivors tried to organize some semblance of defense. Weapons were salvaged from destroyed positions. Ammunition was redistributed to men who could still fight. Machine guns were positioned in crater lips and among ruins, improvised firing positions that bore no resemblance to the sophisticated defensive system that had been planned. Officers tried to organize their scattered units, but with the command structure destroyed and communications severed, coordination was nearly impossible. Major Kobayashi established a command post in a relatively intact section of tunnel and gathered what remained of his unit. 23 men answered the roll call. 119 others were dead, missing, or too severely wounded to fight. These survivors represented what remained of a force that had been supremely confident just 48 hours earlier. As night fell on February 17th, the island was silent except for the moans of wounded men and the occasional collapse of damaged structures. The American fleet lay dark and quiet offshore, preparing for the assault that would come with dawn. The defenders, huddled in caves and ruins, awaited an invasion they no longer had any realistic hope of. Major Kobayashi sat in his improvised command post, writing by the light of a salvaged lantern. His report, found weeks later in the ruins, captured the psychological devastation that accompanied the physical destruction. "We placed our faith in concrete and steel," he wrote. "We believed that properly engineered fortifications could not be destroyed by naval gunfire. We were wrong. The Americans have developed weapons and techniques we did not anticipate. They have demonstrated capabilities our intelligence failed to detect. Most critically, they have shown a willingness to expend whatever ammunition and time is necessary to achieve complete destruction of defensive positions. Our concrete fortresses, which we believed would protect us and allow us to inflict unbearable casualties on the invaders, have instead become our graves. The defensive doctrine we followed with such confidence has proven to be based on false premises. Tomorrow the Americans will land, and we will resist with what little remains. But the outcome is no longer in question." The bitter realization that permeated this report, that everything the defenders had believed and planned for had been catastrophically wrong, represented more than just tactical failure. It reflected the same fundamental miscalculation that had characterized Japanese strategic thinking throughout the war. The assumption that superior spirit and careful preparation could overcome American material advantages, that defensive positions, well designed and strongly built, could withstand unlimited American firepower, had been proven disastrously false. As dawn broke on February 18th, the American landing craft began their approach to the beaches. The men aboard those vessels, Marines who had been prepared for a bloody struggle against heavily fortified positions, were amazed at what they found. The concrete bunkers that intelligence reports had warned would dominate the beaches were simply gone, reduced to rubble by the most intensive naval bombardment in Pacific War history to that point. Landing forces encountered scattered resistance from survivors fighting from improvised positions, but nothing resembling the coordinated defense that had been planned. Major Kobayashi, watching the landing craft approach from a crater that had once been Bunker Complex 7, understood that the battle was already lost. The fortress had failed. The concrete walls had shattered. The confident predictions that properly prepared defenses could stop any American assault had been proven utterly wrong. In 48 hours of bombardment, the Americans had achieved what the Japanese had believed impossible, the complete destruction of supposedly impregnable fortifications. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.